Our guest is Dr. John Henrik Clark, professor of African World History at Hunter College. Dr. Clark spoke at the University of Texas at Austin in November 1973 under the auspices of the university's African and Afro-American Research Institute. Dr. Clark is introduced by Dr. John Warfield, associate professor and director of the institute.
In the annals of all people, we find certain men and women who've been willing to stand any appreciable distance from the herd in order to speak the truth to their own people and to the world. And they have often done that against great obstacles and great adversity. And we're privileged today on this campus to have with us one of those people who has been willing at times when it was unpopular to speak the truth regarding the civilization of man. And within that effort, to place African people in the proper perspective as we look at that civilization in history. Dr. John Henrik Clark, who is the professor of African World History at Hunter College, has been the associate editor of Freedom Ways quarterly journal, produced to speak to the question of black people in the world, and just recently including a 3-year distinguished visiting professor at Cornell University. He's been around among the folk, probably one of the most renowned teachers in the country, publishing many books. His most recent one, Slavery and Slave Trade, with Vincent Harding. And we're very much pleased to have him here today. It is at this point I'd like to present to you our colleague, our brother, Dr. John Henrik Clark.
I want to thank Professor Warfield for the invitation. And what I'm going to be talking about is Africa and the New World, new dimensions in African history, which means a new way of looking at Afro-American history. That means that I will be moving very rapidly over a large body of information, the kind of information that you need to devote a whole semester to. I think I'll begin by questioning the title of my lecture. What do you mean by New World? Inasmuch as the new information on the pre-Columbian presence of the African in the New World tends to prove that there were Africans in this side of the world, in South America and the West Indies, but particularly in the West Indies and parts of South America, as early as 500 BC. And the reading of Christopher Columbus's diary will prove that, according to his own accounts, and he was no friend of the blacks, that he found Africans in the New World doing business with Indians and using minted West African coin. And that when many of the Spanish conquistadors, especially those who went to the area that is the Panama Canal, they found small black colonies with the Indians in South America. And in a work by Walter Van Werthner, dealing with terracotta and sculpture in South and in Central America, he dug up the greatest physical evidence of the presence in the Africans in the New World that has so far been dug up. And in early works of Carter G. Woodson, and in a 3-volume work by Leo Wiener called The African and the Discovery of America, he said, and he pretty much sustained what he said, that the African could have preceded the Indians in this side of the world, and that a lot that you think of as Indian culture is African culture. He got thrown out of Harvard for writing the book. Now, why did this place Christopher Columbus in context with New World discovery? And inasmuch as he discovered a world full of people, then let us assume that the people that he discovered something. And he discovered both Indians and Africans in this side of the world. In actuality, when we look at this year, 1492, look at its great significance in history, maybe of all the things that happened in 1492, maybe the least important thing that happened was this bad navigator started out for one side of the world and stumbled up on the other side of the world. Now, it has been proven that the Portuguese had already charted their movement to this side of the world, and they did not confuse the West Indies with the East Indies as Christopher Columbus did most of his life. And one of the main reasons why they did not come ahead of Columbus, because they had it on their charts and they had established priority. They wanted to build those fortresses along the coast of West Africa they were going to use to hold the slaves while the ships come in. They gave that priority to New World movement. But the Portuguese, who were the master mariners of the day, thanks to the information that filtered into Europe after the Crusades, mostly from China, they had no confusion about how to get to this part of the world. All right, now, my point is, had Christopher Columbus not come, Europeans were going to come anyway. Now, there is all the talk about, which is beautiful folklore, about the debate between whether the world was round or flat. These were old wise tales told in Europe that had no great significance. Now, as the Europeans came out of the Crusades, began to recover some of their own strength, began to stir from the lethargy of the Middle Ages, they made a decision, and that decision still holds, and that is, whatsoever the world is in shape, round or flat, we are going to take it. And that is what they did. And they decided that whosoever ruled the world is going to be one of us. And this decision, coming at a time when there were internal differences between the African states, and when the pluralistic states in West Africa had not settled their family differences, and when they made the horrible mistake of inviting the first Europeans in to arbitrate family differences, they were in serious trouble, because they were making a glaring error, which many African states still made. The African who came to the New World did not yield his African identity. In fact, he began to search for that African identity. And he began, in this period of Holocaust and disarray and mixtures of culture, he began to search not only for his identity in this new world, but his identity in the world. And he knew that he had an identity and a history that commanded respect. And when blacks began to produce an intellectual class in the Western world, that intellectual class, both in the West Indies and America, began to address itself to the definition of blacks in world history, began to attempt to locate blacks on the map of human geography. And some of the pioneers in this movement were scholars from the West Indies. Some Afro-Americans gave up the search and adopted the distorted image that was created by their oppressors. But as early as 18 1881, Edmund Wilmot Blyden, the great West Indian scholar and benefactor of West Africa, addressed himself to this situation when he said, this is 1881 now, and this is his inaugural address at the Liberia College. And if you listen to it, you'll find out that this man in 1881 was ahead of most of the black scholars of today. He would go on to have a great career and to write a classic work that would do well to read today called Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race. He says during this speech, in all English-speaking countries, the mind of the intelligent Negro child revolts against the deceptions and the distortions given in elementary books and geographies and travels and in history. Having embraced or at least ascended to the falsehoods about himself, he concludes that his only hope is to be those things most unlike himself and most alien to his peculiar taste. He goes on to say that one of our great tragedies is that we have spent too much time feeding grist into other people's meals. Then he bemoans, nothing comes out except what has been put in, and that then is our great sorrow. What this man was telling us in 1884 is that we have to reclaim ourselves and our own heritage and the nature of our history. He would go on and he would be the teacher of Africans, and he was the mentor of some of the early black nationalists in Western Africa. And of course, he would write many books. He was the first person to use the word African personality. He wrote a work on African socialism in 1901. He was the first person to champion the unification of Africa during that period, especially West Africa. He entered into a famous debate between Sir Harry Johnson and himself over the religious destiny of Africa, Islam or Christianity. He was of the opinion that Islam would be better for Africa because it was more adaptable to prevailing African ways of life. Then he qualified this, and his qualification need to be looked at today. He said, if the African understood the dynamic qualities of indigenous African religions, he would need neither Christianity or Islam. That's more true today than it was then. Black people have a tendency to get hung up on outside inputs. Now, I am not conceding Islam to the Arabs, and I am not conceding Christianity to white people. I know that we nursed both of these religions in their cradle, and we played a major role in bringing not only this religion into being, but all known religions into being. Because the first salvation-oriented religions the world can trace came out of Africa. And all religions are salvation-oriented. So therefore, the very idea, the very germ, the very genesis of world religions came out of Africa. No, I am not conceding Islam to the Arabs. I am conceding the Arabs' interpretation to him. I am conceding the Europeans' interpretation to Christianity to the European. Because once the European took over this religion for political reasons and began to use it as a political instrument and almost as a framework of his nationalism, Christianity died and Christendom was born. And there's a difference between Christianity and Christendom. Christendom is a political weapon. Christianity is a religious way of life. And for Christendom to come into being and to kill Christianity, then Christendom had to violate every rule that governs Christianity. Had to justify the slave trade, had to justify the monstrosity of the colonial system. It had to justify the demeaning of people. It had to rewrite the history of the world, glorifying Europe at the expense of other people. This is Christendom. And Christendom is forming a task that is anti-Christianity. Now, when this baby called Christianity left its cradle in North Africa and in the Middle East and went over to Europe and was used for political reasons, it was no longer our baby. And when they bring him home and sell him to us, they're selling us something which is alien in its present interpretation to our context. Because if they understood, and this is what Blyden was trying to get across, when you understand indigenous African religions and the binding nature of that religion, you will understand that these religions are basically Christian religions, and that there is nothing in Christianity, in moral law, that isn't already in those indigenous African religions. They never say that I am my brother's keeper, but they keep their brother. They don't preach about it, but they do it. If a young brother dies and he has a wife and children, the older brother takes care. He don't cry about it, gets a little help, but he automatically takes over. It's part of the law that governs the whole society. No homes for the aged, because nobody discards their mother. No homes for the abandoned children, because nobody abandons children. And up until recently, no insane asylums, because nobody went insane. Because the protective mechanism was built into the society itself. Now, with the coming of the Europeans to West Africa, with the misunderstanding of the Christian elements of indigenous African religions, and with imposing Christendom on Africa in violation of Christianity, African societies would suffer. But now we're going to have to look back now at the genesis of the blacks in the New World. And that genesis has to deal with looking at the rise of Europe and the consequences of history involved in that rise. You're going to have to look at what I have been referring to as Europe's evil genius. And that evil genius of Europe began to develop after the Crusade period. The European had developed certain basic technology, principally the gun, not to kill any African or Asian, but to protect himself from himself, but to protect themselves from each other. And the weaponry that the European had developed in Europe to protect himself from other Europeans, once that family dispute was partly settled, that weaponry was used to expand into the broader world. And the Christian story, which he did not buy for himself, about meekness and turning the other cheek, he would go out now and sell it to certain people naive enough to buy it, because the same elements were embedded into his indigenous way of life. And something fell apart. Certain things were misread in history. Now let's look at the consequences of that rise, because this is what would bring the African to the New World. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, fortunately for Europe, unfortunately for Africa, when Europe began to shake off the power and the hold of African domination of the Mediterranean, and I'm using my words well, because that domination of Spain that the Arabs take so much credit for was military African from the beginning. The original conquest of Spain was an African conquest, and a black African conquest at that. And Haile Bourguiba's work, called Tariq Ben Zayed, named after the black general from Mauritania and Senegal who went up to Morocco and organized the force that conquered Spain. In this eyewitness account, he says, the army was as black as ink. The general was blacker still. This would establish African military control. Now, the Arabs did not come into Spain in large numbers until much later, and the Arabs were never in complete control in Spain. The Africans came in at a time, literally, and rescued the Jewish population from the persecution by the Visigoths, and formed a partnership between the Africans and the Jews that lasted throughout the whole of this period and helped to give the Jews their second golden age in Spain. But there are so many partnerships that we have entered into with other people that they have forgotten. They have forgotten. I attended a conference 2 years ago to deliver a paper on the myth of black anti-Semitism, and another person delivered a paper on the genesis of black anti-Semitism. What the hell are you talking about? There is no genesis. Because there is no historical record of dissension between blacks and Jews. And the present day dissension is strictly 20th century and strictly urban. And urban within the last 20 years at that. I'm not going to get too further into this because I got too many other things to do. But my point is that with the decline of Europe, with the decline of Rome, and Europe going into the Middle Ages, saw the rise of Islam and the African military arm of Islam becoming predominant in the Mediterranean, especially in Spain. Now, in the 1450s, this period was over. And fortunately for Europe and unfortunately for Africa, some of the maps that the Jewish gold dealers had used to go down into the western Sudan and along the coast of West Africa fell into the hands of a man called Henry the Navigator. Now, there's no proof that Henry ever went to sea, but the one thing he did which helped Europe in its expansion was to start schools to train people in navigational sciences. But most of the information in navigational science and marine engineering came out of the advanced technology then coming out of China. And it was with this technology Europe used to unlock itself. Now, one of the main reasons why most of the maps were made by Jewish gold dealers, it is because some of the Jews in Spain had come from North Africa and they could handle Indo-African languages. And their relationship with the people in Inner Africa was very good and had been very good for years. Even the years after the dispute the Jews had with Rome, they went down and lived for 400 years. A whole Jewish colony lived in ancient Ghana. Now, this is totally left out of Jewish history, as though it didn't even happen at all. But a Father Williams, who's a little overly partial in the subject, has written a book called Hebrewisms of West Africa. Now, Father Williams tried to prove that everything in West Africa is Jewish. Everything. And more so to the point that after Ghana became independent, some Ghanaian students wanted to impress white people, said that, now, I must tell you that we are one of the lost tribes of Israel. I got tired of the nonsense. I said, look, they only lost 12 tribes, now 30 shows up. Now, some of you people didn't get lost. But if you really want to know the history of the Jewish population in North Africa to the nations in Inner Africa, I mean, there is information on this. But now, the 1400s were bad times for Africa because these were the times that Europe had learned the technique of expansion and had made the kind of boats it needed to take the roar of that mighty ocean and to go on long-range trips. Now, using some of these maps, the Portuguese at first would come down the west coast of Africa. And they would come down the west coast of Africa, not looking for slaves at first, but hearing the legends about the great gold of Africa. Their first trip was to look for gold, look for allies. They had heard about Prester John. And they were looking for Prester John. They were looking on the wrong side of Africa anyway. And besides, he was dead 300 years when they got there. But they'd heard about Sonny Alley. They misspelled his name, but they'd heard about it. They'd heard about Mansa Musa and the famous journey to Mecca and Medina. This man in 1324 went on a journey out of Africa across, being a devout Muslim, to pay his respects, taking with him 280 camels, each with 250 pounds of gold. 500 men marching in front of his entourage with staffs of pure gold. 50 royal hairdressers, and he only had his favorite wives. From 60 to 100,000 people moving across Africa. He married so many of his people into the countries through which he traveled. And on his way home, he said, we shouldn't fight each other now because we are relatives. When he arrived in Egypt, El Amari, a historian, made an account of it. They say, he is Africa, there is nothing else. And though he was a devout Muslim, the Grand Caliph of Islam was in Egypt and asked to see him, to see this man, the great gold king from West Africa. We ain't talking about no savages. Ain't no savage had nothing like this. No organized state, empire, almost as large as the land territory of the United States, with governors and viceroys. Europe was wallowing in its Middle Ages then. European kings didn't even have good shoes when this was happening. And the mats for his horses were made out of better material than European kings were wearing at the time. The same time. This is an age of grandeur in Africa. No savagery. The savage was an invention. And this man decided that he would see the Grand Caliph, but he let him know that he was the equal of any man in Islam. And the general custom when you meet the head of the Muslim faith is to remove his shoes and kiss his feet and remove your shoes, but he don't kiss yours. And he said, no time. We'll meet as equals or we will not meet at all. And he was as devout a Muslim as ever. The main thing that this man did was that he went back, taking an architect named Ibn Asad, and he rebuilt the Western Sudan, the countries in inner West Africa, Timbuktu in the lot. And he opened a great university called Sankore at Timbuktu. Now, it seems very odd for you to understand this, because white historians said there was no higher learning in Africa, nothing. But there were 4 universities in Timbuktu as late as 1594, when the Moroccans destroyed it. 4 universities, and Timbuktu was not the leading university city in Western Africa. It was the city of Dijon. Now, the African was in serious trouble and did not know he was in serious trouble. And the year 1492 helped to set that serious trouble in motion. Now, I have alluded to the New World discovery and Christopher Columbus's accidental ending up navigational error that put him on one side of the world instead of the other. I'm sorry he didn't get to the East Indies. These people were more sophisticated in the East Indies, and he would never have seen home again. Had he pulled the stuff in the East Indies that he pulled on the Indians in the West Indies, they would have washed him. That would have been the end of that. And I'm sorry about the navigational error. He should have gotten to the East Indies. But Columbus set in motion the genocide that destroyed the entire Indian population of the Caribbean islands, to the last man, woman, and child. There is probably not a human being alive who can say he's even a distant relative of one of those Indians. They were totally wiped out. And Christopher Columbus set this in motion. Now, let's go back to 1492 again. 1492 in Spain, the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand had unified certain warring factions of the church. And this unity gave Spain the strength to expel the Moors from Spain. Many of these Moors coming back into Africa, soreheads, began to prey on other parts of Africa. Their expulsion created an internal dispute in Africa. North Africans preying on the people in inner Western Africa. 1492 again in Africa. One of the great African militarists who ever lived, Sonny Ali, then emperor of the Empire of Songhai, died on his way, was drowned on his way from a minor war in the south. And the empire suffered for a year. But later on, 1493, a man came to power who would take inner Western Africa to the apex of its golden age, right in the middle of the slave trade and in spite of the slave trade. His name was Muhammad Abubakar Ituri. Sekou Touré is a direct descendant of this same man. He had been prime minister of the country and head of the army for 30 years. He ruled the country as emperor for 36 years. My point is that the coming of the Europeans to the coast of Africa did not mean the total collapse of African nations. These nations would not begin to collapse in inner Africa until the Moroccan invasion, one of the tragic incidents in Africa. The Moroccan invasion of inner Western Africa using partly white mercenaries. And when we began to look at African history comparatively as events of disaster in Africa, the invasion of the Western Sudan, the destruction of the city of Timbuktu, Guinea, and Goye, the exiling of the great scholars from the university at Saint-Corrie, but the destruction of the city itself is tantamount to the Roman destruction of Carthage. The second worst disaster in the history of Africa. Now, when all of this happened, the nations in inner Africa collapsed and could not come to the defense of the nations along the coast. Now the slave trade could move to the hinterlands just at the time the Portuguese and the Spanish and the English were fighting over territory in the so-called New World, and the Portuguese, thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas, had the big colony of Brazil and had to scramble to increase their slave trade in order to populate this big colony, which was over and beyond anything the Portuguese could do justice to. My point is that in this new world, these Africans began a revolt. They began to revolt on the boat coming over. They continued the revolt to keep from getting off of the boat. And they continued the revolt after they got off of the revolt. And the one thing which would facilitate the revolts of the African in South America and in the West Indies was African cultural continuity. Once you look at these revolts, you will find that you had the most successful revolts where you had the largest amount of newly arrived Africans who had not been adjusted to the plantation system. And once you look at these revolts in context with all of South America and the West Indies, you will find a pattern of revolt in the West Indies and in South America much different from the pattern of revolts in the United States, where you have to take the buying habits of the slave master into consideration. In the United States, the crude, uncultured people, this douce mixture of the human waste matter of Europe. I have said once, and both my students and especially the white professor said that, no, that's too that's too much exaggeration for shock treatment. I wasn't exaggerating for shock treatment. I was saying that Europe literally dumped its human garbage can into the area called the United States. And that you had bad seed from the beginning because Europe's discards in the main populated this part of the United States. A few different types in New England, but not that different. Not that different. Malcontents. Now, in their buying of slaves, they generally bought in small lots and resold a lot. Now you see mama going one way, papa going one way. You see the cultural continuity broken. And when you break a people's cultural continuity, you break their loyalty system. And it is the loyalty system and the institution that produced loyalty system that holds the people together. While in the West Indies in South America, they bought in large lots and kept them together because they thought they could exploit them better that way. They were right. But the one thing they forgot is that they could revolt better that way. And so the nature of revolt in the Caribbean and in the Western and in South America was distinctly different. And besides, an island is a capsule. You're pent up there on this island. And culture can be contained better on an island than in places where you have so much land mass to dissipate people, physically, and to also dissipate their culture. And besides, by buying in large lots, most of the slaves in the Caribbean came from the same general area within Africa and could speak the same basic African language and could maintain the drum language, which was the key to the success of the Haitian Revolution. Now, in the 1660s, these revolts began to develop in Jamaica, especially in Jamaica, not in Haiti right now. The revolts in Cuba in the 1500s, as early as 1522, a slave revolt in Cuba. Now, what you need to understand about the blacks in the New World and the relationship of these blacks to the rest of the history of the New World, that there were continuous revolts. Now, there were revolts of blacks who had been converted to Islam in Africa. There were revolts of African traditional kings whose authority extended to their presence in the New World. And it was nip and tuck, and they could barely make it. One of the little known revolts, and I think properly assessed may turn out to be one of the better ones, is the Babis revolt in Guyana, led by a man named Cuffy. And this revolt would come after the famous Maroon revolt in Jamaica, led by a man named Kojo. Both of these are Ghanaian names. Toussaint Louverture came from a place in Ghana called Kamete. Is it accidental that the most successful revolts in the New World were led by slaves from Ghana? Now, look at Ghana today, and look at Ghana at the period of the slave trade. Their cultural continuity was more or less intact in Ghana when they were taken. And when they came to the New World, they came out of a tradition of revolt, and they could transfer this condition of revolt to this new setting in the New World. Now, in South America and in the West Indies, especially in South America and Brazil, where there were large numbers of black women married to Portuguese men, but these women maintained their loyalty to the people in the field. Now, why is it that in the West Indies and in South America, nearly every slave revolt was engineered by house servant, and nearly every slave revolt in the United States was betrayed by house servant? Now, if you got your West Indian nationalism or your negative Afro-American feeling up, you have immediately arrived at the wrong conclusion. Both of us were victims of a historical experience over which we had no control. Fortunately for the West Indies, they didn't break him up enough to destroy his loyalty systems. Now, there are exceptions. There are numbers of revolts in the West Indies betrayed by house servants, but generally, the house servant was the motivator of the revolt. One of the classical cases was the revolt in the Danish West Indies, finally led by a black woman who called herself Queen Mary. She was the mistress of the governor. And the rebels told her that at a certain time they were going to invade the house, cut the governor's throat, and burn the house down over his head. And she said, "What kind of loyal African do you take me to be? You are telling me just to get out of the house. I am for the revolution, and I understand what I will have to lose." She will have to lose her carriage, which she had, those long, beautiful white dresses imported from Europe that she had, and that set of umbrellas that she had with somebody to carry them over her head. She said, "Inasmuch as I have to leave the house at a certain time, why would you send a man all the way to the house to cut the governor's throat? I would do that before I leave." Now, in spite of the luxury that she had being the mistress of the governor, she had no illusion where her loyalty had to be when the deal went down. And she knew that it was time now for the deal to go down. Now, the same thing happened in Brazil among the black women married to Portuguese men, only they maneuvered in a different way, always marrying off one of her relatives to a Portuguese man newly arrived in the colonies, and making these women swear that they would marry unless marriage meant automatic freedom. And when the Portuguese decided to push into the hinterlands of Brazil, these women convinced the Portuguese that you have no armies up there to protect you or to hold any slaves intact. We might as well free some men to go up and do this labor and pay them some decent salaries. These women laid the foundation for the civilization of Brazil. Some of the first families in the New World were families born from the cohabitation of the slave master and these African women. My main point here is that these African women never lost their sense of commitment to African people. And one of the main reasons why they did not lose their sense of commitment to African people is the fact that their cultural continuity had not been broken. Now, in the 1780s, some of this kind of feeling and spirit began to develop in the United States once the blacks, especially in New England, where you had a large number of black craftsmen who freed themselves by virtue of their craftsmanship. They could create a kind of money over and above that was due their master and buy their own freedom. These black craftsmen, having learned how to read, became conscious of their people's plight and began to develop newspapers, magazines, and journals, and became a part of the abolitionist movement. Once they developed newspapers and journals, they began once more to search for their definition. Then in 1829, a black man who ran a second-hand store named David Walker began to look at the situation and make an assessment of what black people had to do, and issued his famous appeal to the colored people of the world. This appeal was the first theoretical basis of what you call Pan-Africanism, and it was the first call for genuine, raw, unmitigated black power. It was the first rejection of the concept that any people could free themselves without violence. And it was rejection of the imagery and the concept that was laid down for black people. Douglass had some serious questions about it. But out of this spirit and out of this period, a number of journals would be developed. Freedom's Journal, North Star, Douglas's newspaper, and a brilliant Jamaican that a lot of Jamaicans don't know was a Jamaican, John B. Russwam, one of the early black college graduates, would edit Freedom's Journal. He would join the colonization movement in spite of his questions about it. And he would go later to Liberia as governor of one of the colonies. The African awareness now was running rampant among black Americans. Martin Delaney would go out to what is now Nigeria with another Jamaican, Robert Campbell, author of an excellent work called Pilgrimage to My Motherland. My point here is that Caribbean Americans coming to the United States at the time did not see their plight as different from that of black Americans. Prince Hall from Barbados had found the Masons, the black Masons. Peter Ogden from Antigua had found the black Oddfellows and was beginning to use these large oriented organizations as form of protest movements. This was the beginning of the formalization of the black intellectual freedom movement. And during this period, we produced some of the most responsible intellects this country's ever known, and also produced a radical class who excelled any other radicals in the country. But the search for African definition would continue after the Civil War, and it would be reflected in the works of Bishop Turner, a Ghanaian named Chief Sam, who promised to take all black Americans back to Africa. These are the 1880s now. Bishop Turner would last until 1915, when he died, the same year Booker Washington died. Near the end of the century, the whites grew tired of dealing with multiplicities of black leaders, and then they decided that they would create a leader. And after the creation of this leader, the first anointed black leader in America, created by white editorial writers, and white editorial writers have been creating nearly every black leader since then, and those they do not create, they eventually either kill, drive into exile, or drive to suicide. Now, at the end of the 19th century, there was a man who had made a great impression on the white people. His name was Booker T. Washington, and we need to look at Booker T. Washington and look at him anew. Now, if you call him an Uncle Tom, you've never been so wrong in your life. He's bigger than that. And in his Atlanta Compromise speech, when you look at the historical background which led him to this speech in 1895, the speech was all things to all people. One of the most unique speeches ever made in the history of the world. And you should read it, almost read it yearly and analyze it. What in the hell was he talking about? There was something in it for the South, telling the South you need not worry. Something in it for blacks, telling the blacks you've got good white people here who will take care of you, look after you, be skilled artisans. Something in it for the Northerner who owned the South then and now, telling him that there is peaceful labor here in the South who will not start strikes like those immigrant ingrates up north. The tone of the speech was partly anti-foreign, and he knew exactly that it would get across in this setting. He was telling blacks, he attacked the black politician, said stump speeching is not what's going to get it for us. Better open a dairy farm. Then came the appeasement that was dear to the hearts of whites. He said, we apologize for our humble contribution to this expedition. A little pumpkins here and there, some quills, different things that we have done, but the humbleness of our contribution is indicative of our great need. 1895. Now, Booker Washington knew he was telling a lie. He was strategic, playing to the feelings of white people. Now, what had happened in Black America 1895? The black inventor had already revolutionized American industry. Lewis Latimer had assisted in the development of the electric light, had written a book, a textbook on the incandescent light, had drawn up the model for the telephone, because Alexander Graham Bell could not even get a pattern until somebody draw all of its moving parts, and he could not draw all of its moving parts, and this black man was to do that for him. This had already been done in 1895 now. He had done many things, including one thing I'm not too proud of. He had improved the old Gatling gun, forerunner of the machine gun. Elijah McCoy had already revolutionized the lubrication system on the railroads with a drip cup system, which lubricated the railroad in motion. And so many whites stole patterns from Elijah McCoy until anytime a white person go to the pattern office with a lubrication system, the people in the pattern office said, now, is this the real McCoy or something you... Did you steal it directly from Elijah McCoy? And that's how the word got into the language, the real McCoy. And whites were stealing patterns from blacks, right and left. Metzelinga had already created the shoe machine, which made the mass manufacture of shoes possible. The third rail had already been developed by a black man. Another black man had created the coupling to hold all of that weight together. In the Old West, the trains started coming apart, going down the hill. It was costing a fortune. Now, suppose Booker T. Washington had have told those white people what contribution we had made to industry. Do you think they would have given him millions of dollars, by saying, look, we've done this, now we demand this? The technique would not have gone well in that setting. Now suppose Booker Washington had to pull that on, so you people would have to understand, except for us, you may not have had any industry. They wouldn't have given him a nickel. But playing this humble role and telling his people, that it's better to make $1 a day than to sit next to a white person at the opera, that was exactly what they wanted to hear. They wanted to hear a black leader endorse Jim Crow. Now, he may not have been endorsing any Jim Crow. That may not have been his intent at all. But that was the interpretation that was given to it. And not only did they make him the leader of Black America, they gave him more money than they have ever given any black American before or since. It was the co-optation of leadership. And I still question whether we paid too high a price for Booker's existence. If a black man wanted a Pullman porter job or even a streetcar job in Cincinnati, all the white people wanted to know is it all right with Booker? And if it wasn't all right with Booker, you did not get the job. And I'm saying that in this atmosphere coming at the end of the 19th and the end of the 20th century, black people began to search anew for their definition in relationship to Africa, in relationship to the world, began to participate in Pan-African conferences, the one in 1900. Then Du Bois began to challenge Booker T. Washington, but the less known challenger of Booker T. Washington, the most adamant challenger of Booker T. Washington was not W.E.B. Du Bois, but a man that we call the Boston Brahmin, William Monroe Trotter. He's the one that disturbed Washington's meeting in Boston and got thrown in jail. He was the one that took exception to Booker T. Washington stand in the Brownsville raid right here in Texas. A forgotten incident in history. A group of blacks, there are 2 new books on the subject. I don't know if anybody's ignorant. The Brownsville raid was a tragic incident in history. It's been proven later that whites blackened their face and shut up the town in order to get the town excited about driving the blacks out of a local post. Now, when the blacks came to the local post, it was in Huntsville, Texas, Brownsville, Texas, came to the local post, the whites made an assessment of the situation. You've got about 3,000 or 4,000 blacks in the town. And you only got about 36 black families. Men being men, gonna want women. There ain't enough of those, their own kind, so-called, to go around. And maybe they'll entertain other ideas. And maybe we better write the president and get them the hell out of town, in which they did. And when the president, Theodore Roosevelt, did not respond, they took other actions. And the whole idea of the Brownsville raid was to build up public sentiment against the presence of large numbers of black troops in Brownsville. Now, when this tragedy occurred, Booker Washington's no comment gave the public the intention that he approved of the persecution of those blacks. But it was Monroe Trotter that challenged him on this. In the meantime, Monroe Trotter and W.B. Du Bois had set in motion the Niagara movement that would later be converted into the NAACP. Other blacks began to reconstruct black history. Booker T. Washington would die in 1915, and W.B. Du Bois would be challenged by the Garvey movement that had more black followers before and since than any other black movement. And it set in motion a search for identity. And this search was reconsidered during the Italian-Ethiopian War. I think all of this search for definition in this part of the country have led us to where we are today, and it's a fitting time, fitting place to conclude the lecture. Where black people are today, standing on a black and beautiful plateau. There's no question about how he got on the plateau, but that's a serious question is how he's going to get off of the plateau. Because he got hung up with a whole lot of illusions that had nothing to do with power, but has something to do with ceremony. And there's nothing basically wrong with ceremony, so long as you also make a ceremony out of being free. A ceremony out of becoming strong. So long as you understand there's nothing principally wrong or overwhelmingly strong in being black and beautiful. And white people are perfectly willing to concede to black people that they are beautiful. In fact, he will make the cosmetics to make you more so. Beauty never hurt anybody. Beauty never destroyed a nation. But if you say you're black and powerful, then you're in trouble. Then you're in trouble because you're going to change things around. The whole social order will have to adjust to the fact that you are black and powerful. You begin to determine your destiny and the destiny of others. Look at the present thing. Look at today's newspaper. Look at the debates. They are not consulting any one of us. And yet we consist of, properly counted, when you consider the fact that there are from 100 to 125 million blacks in the Western world, between the West Indies, Brazil, the United States, and other areas, just in the Western world. They've been counting Africa's population as being 300 million for 50 years, which means that the African man is sleeping away from home. not reproducing himself. Now you know you not to take anything like that serious. When they count the millions of blacks in Asia that has not been counted as blacks, who are definitely African people, New Guinea, New Hebrides Islands, the people so-called Aborigines in Australia who are still being called niggers, the Doridians in the Middle East, the large black population in Ceylon. When you count all of these people as African people, we are the third, if not the second, largest population on the face of the earth. Africa has the largest amount of untapped resources any place in the world, including oil. Most of the gold of the world comes out of Africa. Most of the hardening process used in gold comes out of Africa. Manganese and the like. Most of the copper in all the world comes out of Africa. Gabon, a little postage stamp country in Africa with less than 1 million people, have the largest bauxite deposit in the world. Africa is the largest geographic reserve in all the world. What made these people think that they're going to make a whole world social order without consulting any one of us? Because you are black and beautiful, and you cannot command the situation or world attention or enter the councils of the world and determine the future of man until you're black and powerful. Then you're going to have to use yourself in an entirely different way. You're going to have to stop copping out into the soft sciences and go into the hard sciences. The science of metals, oceanography, the science of shipbuilding, maritime engineering, new systems of automotive engineering, new ways to stretch railroads across the belly of a continent, new ways of making things grow. You in the Western world have the greatest capacity to unlock Africa and make its riches yield for African people than any other African people in the whole world. So you have a mission in the world over and above that of other African people, inasmuch as you are the largest literate African people, the largest body of literate African people in the whole world. Now what's important now? The bush or the medallion? Or those science textbooks? Or knowing how to make a brickyard and how to manage it? Because the world is giving out of wood and they're still going to use houses. All of Africa's bauxite, we might have to build aluminum houses in the future. All of these things has to be figured out, and figured out by you. Because if you call your farmer master back to cure your child's stomach ache, he's going to re-enslave you based on your need for him. So let's look at history a different kind of a way, and look at what history can do and what it cannot do. It is not a cure-all. It cannot grow a tomato. It cannot saw wood. It can perform the function that history is supposed to perform. It can tell you your time of day. In the book Tom Tom, the writer John Vandercook has said, a race is like a man until it uses its own talents, takes pride in its own history, and loves its own memories. It can never fulfill itself completely. The role and the importance of ethnic history is how well it teaches a people to use their own talent, take pride in their own history, and love their own memories, in order to fulfill themselves completely in their honorable endeavor. Ethnic history is a clock that people use to tell their time of day. It is a compass that they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells the people where they have been and what they have been. It also tells the people where they are and what they are. Most important, the role of history and the understanding of history is to tell a people where they are and what they still must be. Thank you.